I use a microphone. Hello, everybody.
Hello. We're having a lovely evening. Do we all have drinks? Does anybody want to double fist before we start? Now's your last time to go next time? No?
I guess a bit of health and safety before we start. No fire alarms, so if you hear one, follow me. I'm not expecting any, so we're all good. The drinks and the food are back there. If you don't have a drink, grab one really quick. We're about to start our chats. The food will be there between the talks as well. I've seen the menu. Yummy. The toilets are back out the way you came, and they're behind the lifts. So you have to go through those doors to get behind the lifts, and that's where the toilets are. Anything else?
We had some sites that were about OWASP that Dan didn't put up. So, yeah. That's just, OWASP is fantastic. It's great. We love it. It's community-led. If anyone doesn't know what it is, why are you here? Go on the wiki, take a look. There's lots of projects. Get involved. It's open source. It's wonderful. Have a look at Juice Week. Juice Shop?
Juice Shop.
Juice Shop.
Yeah.
Zap. All the things. It's wonderful. Anyway, we would like to... Nothing here is on the educational committee. Please don't tell on me. But we would like to introduce our first speaker, Katie, who is amazing and does all the bug bounty bullshit. She's an absolute star. And I'm going to hand the mic over to her.
Thank you very much for coming. This is actually my first local event in Manchester, outside of teaching students. So it's really nice to be here and actually in person. My fun OWASP story is the very first time I found out about OWASP. I accidentally volunteered at their booth at DEF CON. I went to DEF CON and a friend of mine does stuff with OWASP London, and she was also doing some other volunteering. And she was scheduled to be on the OWASP little stand they have and give out t-shirts and give people little branded books and stuff like that. So she left because she had to go do something else, but they had to have 3 people on. And I was there and I was like, I'll help, I guess. So I ended up sitting on the booth for OWASP and people coming up asking me questions about OWASP and I'd never heard of it before. And then I became an expert in OWASP pretty quickly. And then, as a thank you, because obviously, they hadn't really prepared for this, I hadn't really prepared for this, I got, all the vintage OWASP, DEF CON t-shirts. So it was really nice of them. But yeah, that is how I found out about OWASP. So today I'm going to be talking about API hacking. And if you've watched my videos before, you're going to be like, wow, this looks familiar. And the answer to that, I think you'll find, is that APIs haven't changed since the pandemic started, and therefore neither have my slides. I have actually updated them. I am being a bit facetious, but some of it's going to look really familiar, because APIs really don't change. And that's the reason why I really like hacking APIs. So APIs everyone's kind of afraid of them. They're like, oh look, API hacking, that's a specialty. And I'm sitting there just running Burp Suite, and people are like, oh my god, API hacking, I'm reading the Burp Suite. And the only difference between the two is that when you hack web applications, it returns HTML. When you hack APIs, it returns JSON. And people keep on inviting me to speak to things about it. So that's API hacking. It's not that hard. And I hope what you take away from this talk is that API hacking really isn't hard. It's not hard, it's not scary. I would really love it if you came away from this talk and had a go yourselves, because I promise it's actually probably one of the easier ways to get started in web application security, because you don't need to download and understand a bunch of JavaScript payloads. So a bit about me, because this is a contractual obligation for anyone who does talks, is I've got to prove to you why I'm worth listening to. So I'm a lecturer in cybersecurity at MMU. I'm also the program lead, so if you happen to be a student or former student of mine, which I do recognise some of you, then I'm the course lead for cybersecurity. In terms of my technical background, I have a PhD in NLP and cybersecurity, which when I got the PhD was not a big thing, but now NLP is the hot new thing, right? AI, LLMs, great, I didn't know anything about them. I did a completely different type of NLP, but it's still cool, right? Please give me money. And if you happen to know who I am already, you do not know me because of any of my academic work. You probably know me because I'm a YouTuber. I make videos on the internet teaching people how to get into application security from like a bug bounty perspective. I ended up in 2019 being like a mentee at HackerOne live event. And this is where they bring the best hackers from all over the world, and me, apparently, into a big room and get them to all hack on the same target, and it was Uber. I had never seen a request before in its raw form. I had never used Vert. I had never done anything like that before. And I actually managed to find my first 2 bugs when I was there. And then I was very fortunate to get invited to go to DEF CON in 2019, and it was free. And I'm like, well, not turning that down. It's a free trip to the US to go to DEF CON. Yes, I will accept, thank you. No, I don't feel very qualified. And then when I was there, I spoke to some of the other mentees, and I realized that I was literally just a little bit more further ahead than they were. And my videos very much represent what I think is kind of missing. There's a lot of like how to set up Vert, how to use Vert, what XSS is, but not necessarily a lot teaching you why it works and what XSS is doing under the hood and the kind of technical background behind it. I'm also a former developer. I used to work at a really horrible energy broker in St. Anne's Square as a developer, where I made a lot of APIs. And I had this realization when I was making YouTube videos for the first time. I think it was the video I did on idols. I think it was that one. It's like second or third video. I was like, oh my god, I have deployed so many vulnerable pieces of code that I didn't even know about. Oh no. And I went to Salford Uni, so I've been up in Manchester for 3 years for my degree, and then I came back after my PhD. So introduction to APIs. If you've never heard of an API, what do you need to know? So an API is essentially this type of web application that instead of being for like a user to see and interact with, it's usually for a different system to see and interact with. So instead of it being used, say, by you, it's going to be used by a mobile app that you're using. And essentially, it's usually put in so the developers only write code once. They write the API, and then you don't need to hire, a web developer, a back-end web developer, a front-end person, a mobile developer. You don't need to hire a bunch of different specialties. You can hire like an API team that can manage that. And then you have front-end people who then take that and make it do like fun things. Sometimes these are very intentional. So in the case of like developer APIs, you may be familiar with the Reddit API and the Twitter API. Controversially, who are charging now for API access. But when I talk about API hacking, I'm not just talking about like intentional developer APIs. I am also talking about APIs that are designed to be used internally, they're external, but they're not designed for like regular users to use. The whole idea is write it once, deploy it once, secure it once, right? It's very convenient for that reason. Now, a lot of APIs return something called JSON, and you might already be familiar with JSON, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what it is. It's essentially a way to represent objects in a text-based structure. It originally started in JavaScript, and then everyone's kind of adopted it and gone, yeah, that sounds good, we hate XML. That's the other one you might see. And essentially, it represents this as like objects, which have like curly brackets, and it has arrays, which have square brackets, and everything is contained in an object. It's a really nice format. If you find yourself struggling to read it, what I really recommend is there is a JSON graph viewer, and it shows the actual tree structure of the JSON. It makes it so much easier to read and understand. If you ever work with GraphQL, really recommend it. So there's lots of different types of API out there. There are RESTful APIs, which is probably what you're majority familiar with. That's your like bog standard API nowadays. Returns JSON, is based on a CRUD structure. You have batch APIs, so if you work a lot with mobile, you actually can't just send like 30 different API requests at once, because that drains the battery of the phone. So instead you send one request that has 30 embedded requests that then get sent and managed, which I'm sure is not a security issue at all and has never ever led to any security problems. There are challenges like GraphQL. So GraphQL, instead of having like a bunch of different endpoints, as we'll see, instead has a single endpoint, and because it's developers and developers like writing code, so why doesn't everybody else? instead of having nice little structures, you instead write code in the form of queries that then return results. And finally, SOAP APIs. These are a lot older. They mainly use XML. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because they're kind of boring. Honestly, they're kind of boring. So I'm going to talk about RESTful APIs today. So RESTful APIs, it used to stand for something. It stands for representational state transfer. And if you've ever used a REST API, that is not at all what it means now. So it used to mean this specific type of like how you deal with data and your approach to having like an architecture. Nowadays, it's this structure that sets them apart. Is that a laser pointer? It does have a laser pointer. I can't see where it's pointing. Never mind. I probably just blinded somebody. So it has this really clear structure. So often when developers talk about how they interact with objects, they use this term CRUD. That stands for create, read, update, delete. That is everything you can do to an object in a database or in an API or another resource, right? You can write a new tweet, you can edit a tweet, you can delete a tweet, etc. It just represents that. And RESTful APIs have this really distinct structure. It makes them very easy to spot once you've seen a few. They use get and post. Now they're also supposed to use put and delete, but I'll be honest, they don't. A lot of them don't, and that's how I found my first bug, is realizing that an API was automatically generated rather than being designed for humans. But it's really easy to start predicting what new endpoints would be, right? If you're on Twitter, you have tweets, you have users, you have bookmarks, you have comments, you have images, you have whatever. It becomes really easy to say, okay, we can get a specific tweet, or get a specific image, or delete a specific video on YouTube, or read a specific video on YouTube, whatever. Some of them kind of can be custom, because again, this used to stand for something and mean something, but nowadays it doesn't, and people kind of YOLO it. They just like, I'm just going to develop the API however I feel like it. And then you also have developer APIs. I picked two very non-controversial developer APIs you may have heard of in the last few months. These are specifically designed for developers to access them. And what they have is documentation. And this is fundamentally what makes API hacking really hard, which is that the developers, when they're making their nice third-party applications and integrations, have documentation, and we don't. When we test regular APIs, we don't have any documentation, and that makes it really, really hard to figure out what's actually there. Honestly, I think it's more a problem for companies that have APIs than it is for API hackers. But fundamentally, the stages for API hacking are as follows. The first is find endpoints. So an endpoint in this context is just a piece of code that does something. A piece of code that returns a result. It doesn't return like a 404 error. We then have to test those endpoints for non-API specific vulnerabilities. Again, APIs are just web applications. Any vulnerability that affects a web application affects an API. Your cross-site scripting will work on APIs. Your SQL injection will work on APIs. Every CSRF has an API component to it. SSRF is now in the API top 10, so it's not even just me saying it now, it's now like the OWASP API security project is also agreeing with me that they're just web applications. And then you have API-specific security flaws. Now, when I tell you what these are, you're going to be like, these aren't specific to APIs, Katie. And you'll be right, they're not. They're web application security flaws. It's literally just the same. And the final thing is to escalate. So one of the great things about APIs is because it exposes so much attack surface, you have quite a lot of options for escalating vulnerabilities from, you know, as typical permissions error into a full account takeover, a full organizational takeover. One of my favorite stories, I used to work at BugCrowd, which if you don't know is a bug bounty platform. I saw one hacker go through a single program, test pretty much every endpoint on their API, and literally, like, the program was like, we've had to pause submissions for the time being because they ran out of budget. More than once. And it's big software, it's huge. But yeah, they ran out of money because one person was just rinsing it for one type of vulnerability. Recon is probably the most challenging step. Don't overcomplicate API testing. It's not special. It's the same as any other testing of web applications. It looks different. It is the same under the hood. It is HTTP at its core. Always test APIs for access control issues. They're not API-specific vulnerabilities, but they are the most common. I could start on any API and find an access control vulnerability. They are by far the most common flaws. And finally, what did I write on that slide? APIs are great places for bug chains. Now, if you're thinking API hacking as in API keys, not what I'm talking about. But if you do want to find like API keys that have been leaked, I really recommend this project, TrufflePub. And it's not just because my friend founded the company, but he did found the company. But it's a really cool tool that can help you find things like AWS keys that have been accidentally committed to like GitHub. And it's free, it's open source, it's good. And if you're a company, please buy his product. And that is because I'm his friend. Right, API reconnaissance. So this is the first stage. How do we actually find an API? It's hard. I'm not going to lie to you. This is by far the hardest part. And that's because while APIs are written for machines, they are written by humans. And so while I might see a Twitter post as a tweet, somebody else will see it as a post. And somebody else might see it as a reply, and somebody else. And the problem is, each time you have a new resource name, you have a new endpoint for all of that CRUD functionality, which means that you have to test a lot of words. And people often ask me, Katie, what's the best API word list? And I tell them the dictionary. Because it's kind of true, you really can't easily predict what developers will call their API endpoints. There are some really good tools out there. I really like Kite Runner. Again, it's not just because Asset Note is run by a friend of mine, but it's a good piece of kit and you should use it. No, it's genuinely, it's some of the best stuff. It has context about like how APIs work. So APIs often have like V1, V2, V3. This has found more API endpoints than any other tool I've used. There's also like a GraphQL specific word list now, which I think is next. No, it's not the next slide. It's probably on the later slide. But if they're using custom resource names, like it's kind of a pain. FFUF is a great tool. So I've actually made some videos on this. I really recommend this Kite Runner video because it goes into depth for like how to actually use the tool in practice and showing why it's good. And the second one is the FFUF, which again is, it's not just because it's done by a friend of mine, it's a good piece of software. But my friend has got FFUF, it's a great fuzzing tool, it's really fast, and it's free and open source as well. It's one of the best fuzzing tools that I've personally used. And there's actually this GraphQL word list, which was primarily like a GraphQL thing, but actually has some really great API endpoint lists. A lot of the top hackers that I know, though, go with my strategy, which is click the buttons. And here's an example of Zoom. So I was hacking Zoom recently because I was at HackerOne's live event. And we'll often, when we think about like a piece of software, think about the main thing it does, right? If we're testing Zoom, we're going to test creating a Zoom link, joining a Zoom link, updating wherever, like our avatar, what things we can physically see. But what's really important in API testing, especially in a bug bounty context, is to, obviously to make money, we've got to go into really hidden features. So did you know that Zoom has a third-party app store? Did you know that it has a whiteboard functionality? Did you know that it has the ability to set up a location as like a Zoom room? And you can book physical locations, and they have little iPads that can go in the room that connect to Zoom, so you can book rooms through Zoom. These are commonly where I find my bugs. I don't tend to find my bugs in like the main application. I tend to find it by clicking on these buttons. And genuinely, when you're API testing, sometimes you're better off not using a tool, not using fuzzing, not trying to guess random endpoints that a developer thought, yeah, post, that sounds good. One day, you instead look at what's actually in front of you and what's the APIs actually being called. The bug I found, by the way, was in Zoom whiteboard, and it was an access control bug. One way you can do this is you can turn it into a spreadsheet. Often with APIs, we've got such a large attack surface, we've got so much stuff to see, that a spreadsheet is often one of the easiest ways to see what we've tested and what we haven't tested. Now, do I personally use a spreadsheet? No, absolutely not. My form of hacking is what I call chaotic. I had, no joke, the HackerOne had brought in this journalist, right? And they got like best hackers in the world to come and speak to this journalist, make HackerOne look good. And they were like, what is your hacking process? And I was like, I don't really know. What do you mean? I mean, I just kind of find bugs, I don't know, I guess. I'll be honest, I have found so many bugs in just having that attitude of exploring the application, looking at the API and trying things. It is something where you can be a lot more experimental. Though there's a reason why I work as like a bug bounty hunter and not a pen tester. Because Lord knows my pen test would not be whatever MITRE approved. That's what we're doing this week, right? So the API Top 10. So the API Top 10 is a project in OWASP, and I'm not gonna introduce my controversial opinions about the API Top 10. It's a list of concerns that developers or people managing security teams who have APIs should be thinking about. These aren't necessarily API specific, they're not an inclusive, all-encompassing list, but they are a good place to start with them. So, first one we've got is access control issues at the object level. If problems with authentication, so logging on, resetting your password, flows that tend to get a bit broken. Number 3, which is another access control type, don't worry, I'm not skipping over the access control, they've got their own little slide. Another access control issue. If it was the OWASP top 10, would it have access control 3 different times? I don't know. I said I'm not going to talk about my controversial opinions. Unrestricted resource consumption, which you might know as something like DDoSing, where in an API context, you might have your API deployed on really low resource stuff. So you need to pay extra to get more resources. So when you get a DDoS attack, it very quickly turns into how do we spend $20,000 on AWS this month? Because of the types of things, broken function level authorization is another access control issue. Unrestricted access to sensitive business flows is all about the fact that, and it kind of fits in with the unsafe consumption, that APIs are fundamentally part of a flow. They're part of a flow of stuff that happens from your website, it goes into something else. The API is never usually the final destination. Stuff is always happening outside of it. SSRF, server-side request forgery, which is a regular web application security vulnerability. That's not API specific. Security misconfiguration, which covers a range of different things from leaving debug mode on to intentionally turning off security features. I'm looking at you, the top result for Laravel CSRF token mismatch. Improper inventory management is when you leave old stuff that's still broken online. Actually, I saw a really fun, it wasn't my bug, it was somebody else's, where they had gotten a bug fixed, marked it as resolved on HackerOne. Then they submitted the same bug again and said, look, this bug is resolved, but it's still there because you haven't deprecated the API yet. And they actually paid it twice. And I already talked about safe consumption. So essentially, and if I tell you nothing else, this is the bug you look for. It's access control in these 3 different ways. So APIs often have these 3 different levels of access control. So the first is object-based. So that is, does the resource you're trying to edit belong to you? Is this something, is this your tweet? Is this your YouTube video? Is this your email? What usually happens is they miss a check that says if, resource, owner, equal, auth, currently logged on user, that's usually missing, and it will just let you do it. I cannot tell you how prevalent this is. Literally, because I'm under an NDA with BugCrowd, because obviously I sat for work. It is so common. It is genuinely, if I can recommend you search for anything, it's that. And it's really common actually in automatically generated APIs. Anything where you have a framework, because what tends to happen is they'll just generate the API and go, great, let's ship it. And don't actually go into it and figure out, is the security control actually in place? Then you have the property level, so the object is the tweet. The property level is the text the tweet contains. So quite often the way I see this is that when you change your password, you'll get asked to put in your old password and then get your new password and then set your new password. But in our APIs, you can often just change the password in like the change user details without any other information. So that's a really common one, but usually you see it as information disclosure. You know, if you're booking a hotel, it should tell you, are there rooms available, yes or no. It shouldn't tell you the name of everyone who's in every single room, that kind of thing. And then you have permissions. Now, while I say that object level issues are by far the most common, permissions from a bug bounty context is what you should look for, because everyone else has got those. And if you want to dive into bug bounty hunting where you've got more of a competition, you've got more of a kind of push to find stuff, you want to look at complex permission hierarchies. So I'll use another example. Recently I was hacking MuleSoft. I don't know, is anyone familiar with MuleSoft any point? Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's horrible. It is this like huge, overwhelming, like full-on platform, but fantastic for finding bugs in, because everyone else is like, oh my god, I don't want to look at MuleSoft. Please don't let me look at MuleSoft. And notably, this can be going vertically, so you can get like an admin action as a regular user, but it can also, and perhaps more commonly, be horizontal against tenants. So if you're dealing with a cloud application where you have individual tenants and you have different users at different levels, an admin at organization A shouldn't be able to affect organization B. However, often you can. These are super common in like really complex enterprise software. And in a bug bounty context, again, if it's more complicated, less people are looking at it. So in a bug bounty context, I recommend that. The way I do it is do something called a cookie trick. So the way you test for this is you essentially make a request to the API, remove the cookie, and if it still works, congratulations, you found a bug. You're a lucky winner today. And it really is that easy. Like, it's not particularly technically challenging. It's literally going in there, removing the part that says cookie, and then seeing if it still works. What it is, though, is really, really time-consuming. It takes forever to do manually, and you might be thinking, oh, you can automate that. And that is why a lot of people who do API hacking, like, not fail's quite a strong word, but that aren't necessarily getting the same results as other people. I'm just looking at the time to make sure I'm not talking too much. Next trick is having two accounts and replacing one account's cookie with another account. Now, I really messed up when I made the video that talked about this like 3 years ago, because I've had nothing but problems since. If you replace user A's cookie with user B and you affect a resource owned by user B, that is not a bug. You have to affect user A's resource. Please stop sending me emails. I promise you the program's not screwing you over. You just misunderstood, and I was bad at explaining things. And again, it's not super complex, right? That is literally just copying and pasting, but it takes somebody with the kind of brain of going in there and trying these things and realizing, okay, can I try and delete someone else's tweet? Can I try and edit someone else's tweet? Can I try and edit this and edit that and view this, view that unauthorized? So the way I really like to do this is using a Burp Suite plugin called PwnFox. It's so good. So essentially, you can make it so you have little container tabs. So your tabs have different cookies, and they can be color-coded, and in Burp, they're also color-coded as well. It's very good. You would not think that color-coding would be this good. It's so useful. So I really recommend that. I've actually got a video coming out in like a few weeks on how to use that and set it up and do it properly. But again, if you're testing for access control issues, PwnFox is genuinely one of the best things. And it's free and open source. And this time, my friend didn't make it. So another common one I see is information disclosure, whether that's PII or things like error message disclosure. I've got a really fun story, which I don't know if I have time to tell the full fun story, but I will briefly describe what happened. I used an error message in like the API to figure out not just what software that server was running, but a dependency of that software and a dependency of that dependency. And I found a bug in the dependency that then like iterated through. It was like fully third party, so I know a lot of people are like, did you really get banned for that? Yes, because the like client was super, like, I can't actually say who it was, but I literally strict NDA on that one. But it's like a super big like software platform. Integrations are great places to look for business logic errors. I'll use an example by Zoom because they told me it was intended functionality. So this isn't disclosing anything. In Zoom, when you join an organization, even with your personal Zoom account, the Zoom admins can delete your account. That doesn't delete your account with the organization. Oh no, that deletes your personal account as well. Intentional, by the way. Zoom said that, so it's fine. And more than that, if they delete your personal account, they also take control of literally any documents you've ever shared on Zoom, become the property of the whoever deletes it. So again, it's intended, so it's fine. It's intentional is their security, but that's the kind of thing I mean when I talk about third-party integrations of business logic errors. It's the kind of, is that right? Is that really how you want that to work? APIs are not special, Jesus Christ. I still use Burp. I don't use Postman, I don't use anything. In fact, I would say if you know how to use Burp, congratulations. You know more than me than when I first found my first API security vulnerability. Genuinely, I still use Burp. I use Burp for everything. I don't use Postman, I don't use any other third-party tools. I do Burp and I hit buttons. Every kind of traditional acronym you can think of, XSS, SQI, all have attributes that make them API security flaws. For example, with cross-site scripting, if you find that in a web view on an app, you can use the currently logged on person's cookie with the API, and it makes for a really interesting security bug. What I really recommend doing, if this is something you're interested in, is looking at this newsletter, which is API Security IO. They have a section each week on different API security bugs, and you'll very quickly realize that these are not API-specific security bugs. They are literally just security bugs. Mobile apps are fantastic places to find API issues, particularly in batching APIs, because it's kind of a new way of thinking about how an API should work. And something like PayPal is a great example because they send multiple requests in one. It's like a field day for just changing that and making it do something else, right? Really recommend that. And I don't think it's time for me to demo it, but you can imagine there was a demo and you can all think, wow, that was a great demo, Katie.
That's amazing, Katie.
Thanks. If you would like stickers or business cards or badges, or I've got swag here, but otherwise if people want to ask questions, I don't know, do we have time for questions?
We have time for questions.
So everyone has questions. Yes?
Have you got any other gRPC APIs?
So I don't actually know that much about gRPC APIs personally, but I do know that they are rapidly becoming some of the best places to find bugs. I know a lot of other people are basically printing money with them. But no, I usually test RESTful APIs or GraphQL. GraphQL is kind of my particular specialty. Yeah?
What should we do as developers to stop being hacked? What's the API development approach we should do?
It's a really good question, and unfortunately I don't have an answer for it. And I don't think anyone else.
What are you teaching your students?
I'm teaching my students how to not hack the university. You tell anyone, it's the first thing we tell them is don't hack the. So I think there's a few things you can do. One is having a good culture around security. So if somebody contacts you and says, I found a vulnerability, could they be a scammer? Yeah, of course they could. Could they be somebody who's just trying it on? Yeah. But having a system, like a vulnerability disclosure program at the very least, or just having a security email address that people can contact you at, I think is really great. Having an open kind of understanding that security issues happen, right? You're not going to prevent every security issue. Things just slip through and people make mistakes. And it's not making that a huge issue. I've seen a lot of companies who will get on developers and be like, why are you publishing vulnerable code? And it happens. Development cycles are such that we have to get code out there, and that sometimes means, yeah, it's unsecure or it needs more work. And it's having that attitude of, okay, yeah, you've made a mistake, but blah, 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 blah. Practical issues, it's make sure access control works, because that is the #1 thing I always see is access control, particularly on stuff that maybe people aren't thinking about. Having an API inventory, so having a list of all your API endpoints and making sure people can't just like deploy more API endpoints without you knowing about it, really helps just that overall knowing what you have out there. A lot of the API security problems are, we didn't know that was live. And I've actually seen like Yahoo, at these HackerOne live events, they have a prize that they give out for any hacker who finds a bug in a software that they didn't even know it was out there or existed, and that they owned. So and stuff like that happens all the time, even at smaller companies, but Yahoo can afford to pay a bonus for that.
Look in the corner. Daisy.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
What tools are you using for GraphQL endpoints?
So I use a standard GraphQL introspection query, and then GraphQL Voyager to visualize it. However, with big GraphQL APIs, it actually doesn't work, it breaks. So with those, I recommend putting it into just a JSON viewer and literally going through it manually. It's not as nice, but yeah, it kind of sucks.
What happens if they don't have introspection turned on? Where do you go then?
Oh, I have thoughts on this. So introspection should be on by default. It's not actually insecure to have introspection on, and it's actually quite a lot of API security vendors I've seen actually are like, your introspection is turned on, that's a high risk issue. It's not. Introspection is by design of GraphQL. If it is also, I do my standard click all the buttons and see what works. You can start to notice a lot of patterns, even in GraphQL APIs where you have resource names, create resource or whatever, change password. You'll start to see that structure emerge, and once I can see that structure, I start to like mentally predict what I think is there. But that's intuition, and that doesn't really feel on a slide.
So what do you believe of the databases like Apollo that GraphQL turned off already in their production? Introspection turned off.
I think it should remain on. But also I'm a hacker, so maybe you should listen to me. It's not insecure, is what I'll say on that. Introspection is by design in GraphQL. There are legitimate developer uses for it as well. And if your GraphQL API is being published to developers, it should be part of your documentation because it can give really useful insights on things like data types. And understanding the structure of like a third-party API. I understand why people turn it off though, because literally I've seen people report introspection being turned on and then getting angry, so like, I've been screwed over. You haven't. I'm sorry, but you haven't. It's by design. Any other questions? Yeah?
How important is automation and sort of private tooling to maybe develop on the certified bugs?
To find bugs?
Yeah.
There are mixed opinions on this. So I think there's two different types of hackers. I have seen hackers who have really strong automation flows and who are printing money with it. When I worked with Bug Crowd, there were situations where hackers were doing automation would go out of scope and still get paid a bounty. So because they had these full like automation pipelines, I don't do that. And there are quite a lot of hackers like me who don't. I use Jason Haddix as an example. He also, while he does his full recon methodology, he doesn't actually advocate for a full automation-based flow. He often recommends you go through the results manually. I personally have found a lot of success in literally just clicking on buttons and going through endpoints like normal, which is why I recommend it. I think the problem is when you start to go into that automation, you are going up against people who have really solid pipelines. They haven't gone to ChatGPT and gone, how do I use the request module in Python? They have like really strong developer experience, really strong DevOps experience. Sturk, for example, I was chatting to him once about, what is it? My mind's gone back. I was chatting to him about, race conditions. And he was like, yeah, if I'm looking for a race condition, I'll like look up where the server is geographically and buy a server next to it. And then it doesn't matter how much that costs. And it's like, okay, well that's not in the budget for me, because I came here for free. But yeah, it depends on the hacker. You know, a lot of people have those. I think there's a great article that Codingo wrote It's on like point-in-time recon versus recon over time, and that recon over time, that finding those passive as stuff goes up, is far